Hi, my name is Harrison Whitecloud. I'm a rock and metal producer, and today I'm taking you through my metal drum mixing workflow. And to briefly explain the routing, these are my original audio tracks, and these are feeding redundant auxiliary tracks, um, namely for gain staging. Uh, and yeah, I feel like I have more control from here, like phase wise, balancing wise. So that's why they're there. But I usually ignore those after I have them set. And these are my main tracks to work with for mixing drums. These feed my parallel processing, which is mainly compression and a reverb. All of these feed my stereo drum bus, just an auxiliary track. And then this feeds my master fader, which is just a stereo auxiliary track. Um, that might simulate the workflow of like a console, and that's kind of my idea behind all of this is I come from mixing on analog, so that's why I have it set up this way. I do my automation from here, and the output of this feeds my stereo bus processing, and there's a compressor, EQ, and limiter, and all that other kinds of stuff, but that's turned off except for the limiter to make the stream for the video loud. So yeah. All right. Getting into it, I'm looking for 3 things. So I'm looking for, volume, panning, and phase to be the building blocks of this drum sound. And starting with phase, to briefly explain how to get a drum set in phase is to start with your overheads, get them sounding full and in phase. Then, putting up your close mics for your snare in a blend between the overheads and those close mics. Get that sounding thick, and then, I push up every other microphone from the kit against that blend, and I flip the phase, and I listen for the snare to get fatter, and if it gets thinner, then it's out of phase, so I do that for every microphone, and I mean every one of them, and, if they're all supporting the snare, then that's how you know your kit is in phase. At least that's how I work. There's no rules, so do whatever works for you, but I find that I get the best results when I have nothing canceling out my snare. So there you go. Next would be panning. And to explain this workflow, I listen in between my overheads, right? So I have stereo pair of overheads and I blend them to make sure that the snare sounds like it's in the center between my two speakers. And I then take anything in the kit that needs to be panned around. So toms, hi hat, ride, china, sometimes even kick too. But I take all of those and I solo the overhead and I look in between my speakers to see where they are, like physically in front of me. And I will find where it lies in the stereo spectrum and pan it using the pan knob from the individual microphone itself. And there's two things you get from this. It's a natural um, blend and kind of spacing out of how the drum set actually sounds. And when you find that sweet spot of where the panning is, it gets the most in phase as well. Um, and some might argue, like, if you get the snare fat as far as phase goes, but it makes a tom a little thinner sounding, like that's a sacrifice for me that is worth it because I could just EQ some more and bring that fatness back. Okay. And then the last thing is just the volume balance. So let's take a listen to what I got here. It's just a regular metal kind of track. Okay. So now I am going to dial in my parallel compression, and this is going to bring the shells um, forward some more. So I send my kick, snare, all my toms, and my hi hat ride in China to this Neve 33609 plugin from UAD. And I essentially just kind of copy over the blend of what's happening over here after getting an overall balance. slow attack, fast release, 4-to-1 ratio, and usually about 4 dB worth of gain reduction. So let's hear how that sounds. So all that that does is it gives me a good volume boost, which is what I want, and it also just kind of fattens up this not the snare, just the whole kit, and makes it just more punchy. I'm looking for more punch, and I got it with that. Next is the Sound Toys Devil Lock. Now, the only things that are feeding this very powerful compressor is the snare, my four toms, like not my floor, my four total, one, two, three, four toms, and the stereo rooms that I got. And what I get from this is just some more excitement, punch, and ambience for the snare and the room itself. So both of these engaged and disengaged. So pretty punchy sound already without having to screw around with the EQ quite yet, you know? And yeah, the first stage of this is essentially just dialing in all of my compression. So, um, I will usually kick these guys in sometime later. You say EOLX, these normally would be distressors, but I have the Valley People Dynamite from Softtube on there. And, you know, very fast release. And this just kind of adds a lot of excitement to the kick and the snare as well. Let me actually send these to where they're supposed to go. And yeah, let's take a listen here. And those are kind of my reinforcement parallel processing tracks, especially when the kick and the snare might be lacking a little bit. Um, yeah. So, I get an overall balance for the parallel compression, and it changes as I start to process a lot more. So I have to keep an eye on how much I'm compressing and how much I might need to take away from the threshold and the balance because it's getting too squashed. But it's a good starting point. Speaking of starting points, this is my BX SSL 4000G starting point. So usually leave the gate off. Um, you know, some of these frequencies already picked out. And this is where I start to set my compression on the individual channels. And this is more of like subtle sweetening. So let's go ahead, 2-to-1 ratio, uh, fast release, looking to just kind of lightly feather this compression across all the tracks. So I'm getting another volume boost, but it's also kind of squashing things a little bit more, making it more exciting. Briefly touching base on the gate, I would say just copy these settings and then play around with the threshold. Um, like this really is kind of the best gate inside of Pro Tools, in my opinion. And it really helps clean this stuff up. And if you got any more issues with bleed, then you could always just go back to your audio track and just kind of chop it up. See, I've done that for the snare and some parts of the toms if need be, but usually it's set it and forget it if it's a good drummer. So yeah. I usually don't set up the compressor on like individual cymbals like the hi-hat ride in China, but just because why not? I'm gonna go and do it anyway. Not using any of the kick mic or kit mic. I didn't really like how it sounded. So now that we got all of these on here, and all the faders that are down right now from these purple tracks are just ones that I didn't like the sound of. But let's hear with the SSL style stuff on it and without. At this point, I would add some global EQ. So I'm using the trusty FabFilter plugin. And I like to work with very big, broad strokes, and then dialing it back in with some smaller or other, um, boosting or cutting. So usually have a filter on the top and so I notice all of these are sounding pretty muddy. So I'm gonna screw around with this area over here. So just controlling some of the mud, boosting some low end, boosting a little bit of top end. Next for me would be getting this basically Fairchild compressor on here. And I usually leave the high pass filter way up, slow attack, fast release. So I'm absolutely crushing it, but I use this as a more parallel compression across the whole drums themselves, usually leaving it around 40 to 50%, and that gets it pretty exciting sounding. And as you can see, I really haven't done too much EQing. Um, there's people that are more like the CLA type where it's like boost everything and cut everything and do whatever. Like I like to just kind of preserve the natural integrity of the drums and then start to get pretty heavy handed with stuff. So I'm going to start doing some filtering and more EQing. So just did some filtering, just cleaning up all around. Um, Now I'm gonna get into EQing. So obviously we want a nice, really heavy kind of attack on the kick drum. Cutting some 1.5K just sounded too ugly to me, around 2K. Controlled some mud. I'm gonna add some low end now with this Amec plugin right here. And basically I'm boosting 9 dB at around 60-ish. It's a ton of low end, so I'm using this EQ to kind of dial back that low end. And what happens is you get the fatness of that low end, and taking it out kind of gives you an interesting EQ curve. So I really like doing that. Next is this UAD 1176 slow attack, fast release. And then I usually hit it with FabFilter Pro Q3 after this as well. Starting position, very big move. Next, the snare, kind of the same stuff. So the bleed is way too much for me right now, so I'm going to go ahead and use FabFilter Saturn. Do the nollie snare gate trick, high end from 1K dynamics, basically really low. Controlling some ugly mids that I don't like. Next is same thing with the low. If it's sounding too boxy for me, I'll just go ahead and turn this down. $11.76. Pro Q3, getting heavy-handed again. Toms, same deal. Essentially I'm just boosting the high end, controlling the ugly mids, and then getting the low end right. And in that order, it's kind of like clockwork most of the time for me. So getting to this tom here. I didn't like those mids, so now I can go to this EQ right here. And most of the time, I don't really compress much after that, but just getting the low end right. Basically, just hitting the same EQ curves. Hi-hat, ride, and China, I'm usually taking out a whole bunch of like 200, basically pulling a lot of that snare and low end that we don't really need. I usually like to just kind of follow the same EQ curve. Same here. They're same mics, so why not? Usually leave it at just that. Going into the overhead. Usually the same thing for me. I like to use this trick with the Pro Q. Sorry, the Pro C. Um, this is my overhead compression, and I usually get -2 worth of gain reduction, and it really pulls out the cymbals in a very nice way. And letting the snare trigger it, you know, going into the Fab Pro Q. And I like to use this trick that I learned from Dave Otero. So again, big boy move. Then using Soothe. Essentially, the more you turn this up, the more it soothes that area. And then I hit it with another EQ. Which is a good way to get crispy cymbals without them blowing off your head, you know? So these are already compressed, and I'm gonna do some of the same stuff, honestly. Essentially, I like to preserve this area of the rooms and kind of tame this as well. That essentially kind of protects the life of the room, but also gets rid of a lot of that honky kind of ness. Um, my style, I like to keep things relatively natural sounding. Um, and with that, I can make it sound natural and kind of out of this world, spacey goodness at the same time. So let's double check our parallel compression. This obviously doesn't have a meter. See what's good with the reverb. Super plate, go to the gold 240, uh, 1 point whatever millisecond delay I got on there. Um, I usually put a real delay with, however many milliseconds. Um, I prefer this over like an actual pre-delay from the plugin itself. I find that that is struggling to make that happen um, in a nice way most of the time. So hitting this with some EQ. So that's essentially my workflow. Things are sounding pretty punchy. Once you start to bring in other elements, stuff is going to completely change. Usually, I set my base processing and then hit stuff with the Pro Q3 with some big boy moves, really carving some stuff out and making them what they should be. So now what this needs some more of is just some overall glue. I love to use the SSL bus compressor for this. In the real world, I'm using the Smart C1LA. It's an analog SSL copy that I really like. It's very transparent, but this is always a go-to for me. And I'm always hitting it pretty hard, 2 to 1. and I'm less of a fan of how plug-in compression sounds for like overall mix bus compression. Uh, but I just love hitting it super hard, 2 to 1. It just really glues everything together the way that, 4 to 1 doesn't, 3 to 1 doesn't for me. Even with the side chain turned on, I just prefer it as it is, just slow attack, fast release. By this time, I hit it with the AMEC 250. In the real world, I am also still using the Sontec EQ. I have a real one of what they're modeling here. Um, and I find that this does a pretty good job, but yeah, hardware, I just really like how it sounds. But I'm usually boosting, and like this is the overall tone shaper of the mix for me. Next would be Gullfoss. Gullfoss is always awesome. Usually followed by this guy, just taking out some of 200. And then lastly, followed by the Waves S1 Imager. And there you have it. That is the gist of all of this processing. And I think of all of this as just small bits of processing that add up over time. This doesn't encapsulate all of what I would do. I'm not talking about samples or anything, and I'm not going too deep into whatever other stuff that I might use, but this is my starting point. And I find that if you could get a great starting point, then getting the rest of the mix to gel with what you're aiming for is a lot easier, especially when you use the volume panning and phase trick. Um, so, yeah, let's take another listen here. Let's go to the fat part of the song. Like I said, it's a great starting point. I would be changing a lot right now, but this isn't a full mix. But yeah, add or take away from uh, whatever. Apologies, I just ran out of space on my phone, so I'm just finishing without the camera right now. But yeah, that's my overall workflow. Feel free to add or take away from what helps you and doesn't help you. This is in my opinion, the right way of handling hyping up the real natural drums as they are and preserving the identity of the player and the recording, while at the same time just, I don't know, having a lot of flexibility. And there's no rules, so just work with whatever works for you, man. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope I helped out, and I'll see you guys next time.